There are moments in history when the line between justice and vengeance dissolves entirely, when the weight of a stolen crate becomes heavier than the lives it claims, when 7 men stand at the edge of a canyon and realize that the ground beneath them was never solid to begin with. Red Valley in 1926 was such a place, a stretch of Wyoming wilderness where mining camps clung to cliff sides like desperate prayers, where dynamite meant survival, and where the Harrington outfit ruled with code as old and unforgiving as the mountains themselves. This is not a story about heroes. This is a story about what happens when desperation meets pride, when theft becomes betrayal, and when a group of men decide that some debts can only be paid in blood. The names have faded, the valley has changed, but the question remains, what are we willing to become when someone takes what we need to survive? The winter of 1926 came early to Red Valley, descending upon a Wyoming landscape with the kind of cold that settles into bones and refuses to leave, the kind that makes men huddle closer to fires and speak in whispers about supplies running low and work growing scarce. The valley itself was a wound carved into the earth by centuries of water and wind, a deep scar flanked by red sandstone cliffs that glowed like embers at sunset and turned the color of dried blood when storms rolled in from the west. At the bottom of that wound, where cottonwood trees twisted along a frozen creek and sagebrush dotted the rocky soil, 3 mining operations competed for the same depleting veins of copper and silver that had drawn prospectors here a decade before. The largest of these operations belonged to the Harrington brothers, Caleb and Marcus, 2 men whose reputation preceded them like the smell of sulfur before a match strike. They ran their crew with military precision, demanding loyalty above all else, and in return they promised steady pay, fair treatment, and the kind protection that came from being known as men who never forgot a slight and never failed to settle a score. Their camp sat on the northern edge of the valley, a collection of canvas tents, wooden shacks, and supply sheds clustered around a central cookhouse where smoke rose in thin columns every morning before dawn. The Harrington outfit numbered 23 men that winter, most of them drifters who had worked mines from Montana to New Mexico, men with callous hands and quiet eyes who understood that in places like Red Valley, you kept your head down, did your work, and never questioned the hierarchy that kept the operation running. Caleb Harrington was the elder, 42 years old, with a face weathered by wind and sun until it resembled the very cliffs he mined, his voice low and deliberate, his decisions final. Marcus was younger by 4 years, quicker to anger but equally committed to the outfit's survival, a man who carried a Colt revolver on his hip even when he slept, and who had once beaten a claimed jumper half to death with his bare hands before dragging him to the nearest rail station and putting him on a train east with a warning never to return. Together, the Harringtons had built something resembling order in a region where chaos was a fault, where every man looked after himself and alliances shifted like sand in the wind. The Dynamite arrived in Red Valley on a cold Tuesday morning in late November, delivered by a freight wagon that had traveled 3 days from Casper, rattling over frozen ruts and navigating switchbacks that dropped away into nothing on one side and rose like fortress walls on the other. The shipment contained 40 crates, each one packed with sticks of 40% gelatin dynamite, blasting caps wrapped in oilcloth, and coils of fused wire that smelled faintly of sulfur and kerosene. For the Harrington brothers, this shipment represented more than just explosive power. It represented the difference between progress and stagnation, between clearing new tunnels before winter closed the valley entirely and sitting idle while competitors moved ahead. Mining in Red Valley required dynamite the way a body requires blood, and without it, operations ground to a halt. Men sat unemployed, and the delicate economy of the camp collapsed. Caleb Harrington personally oversaw the unloading of the crates, checking each one against a manifest, running his fingers along the rough pine slats, nodding to his foreman to stack them in the main supply shed under lock and key. The shed itself was a sturdy structure, built from railroad ties and roofed with corrugated tin, situated at the center of camp where it could be watched at all hours. 2 men were assigned guard duty each night, rotating shifts, their instructions simple. Anyone who approached the shed after dark without authorization was to be challenged immediately, and if they didn't turn back, they were to be stopped by whatever means necessary. The Harringtons had learned long ago that in isolated camps, theft was as common as frostbite, and the only way to prevent it was through vigilance, reputation, and the willingness to make examples when necessary. The Dynamite sat in that shed for 3 days, untouched, while Caleb and Marcus planned the next phase of their operation, marking tunnel routes on hand-drawn maps, and calculating how many charges they would need to break through a particularly stubborn granite seam that had resisted pickaxes and sledgehammers for weeks. On the fourth night, under a moonless sky that turned the valley into a void of absolute darkness, someone cut the padlock on the supply shed, slipped inside, and made off with 7 crates of dynamite, leaving behind only the empty space where the crates had been stacked and a single strand of cut wire that gleamed dully in the lantern light when the theft was discovered at dawn. The discovery came when Marcus Harrington himself went to retrieve supplies for the morning shift, his breath misting in the freezing air, his boots crunching over frost-hardened ground as he approached the shed with a ring of keys in hand. He noticed a broken lock immediately, the hasp hanging loose, the door slightly ajar, and for a moment he stood perfectly still, processing what he was seeing, his mind running through possibilities and landing on the one he least wanted to accept. He pushed the door open slowly, letting the pale morning light spill into the dim interior, and saw the gap where the dynamite should have been, saw the disturbed dust on the floor, saw the faint drag marks leading toward the door. His reaction was not loud or theatrical. Marcus Harrington did not shout or curse or storm to the camp demanding answers. Instead, he walked calmly back to the cookhouse, found his brother drinking coffee by the stove, and said in a voice devoid of emotion that they had a problem. Caleb set down his cup without a word, pulled on his coat, and followed Marcus back to the shed, where he conducted his own silent inspection, kneeling to examine the drag marks, studying the angle of the cut lock, estimating the weight of what had been taken, and concluding that whoever did this had helped at least 2 men, maybe more, working quickly and quietly under cover darkness. The brothers returned to the cookhouse and called a meeting of the entire outfit. 21 men gathered in a rough circle as the sun climbed over the eastern ridge and turned the red cliffs the color of rust. Caleb spoke first, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made men listen without interruption. He explained what had been taken, what it was worth in money and in operational capability, and what it meant that someone had violated the camp's security, had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. He did not accuse anyone present. Instead, he made it clear that the theft was an act of war, a declaration that the Harrington outfit could be raided with impunity, and that such a declaration could not stand unanswered. Marcus added that they would find out who was responsible, that they would recover what was taken, and that when they did, there would be a reckoning. The men listened in silence, their faces grim, understanding that what came next would not be pleasant, but also understanding that this was a code they lived by, that in places like Red Valley, reputation was everything, and once lost, it could never be fully regained. The investigation began immediately, with Caleb and Marcus organizing small teams to scour the valley for signs of the stolen dynamite, questioning men at rival camps, checking wagon tracks, and talking to anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual in the days leading up to the theft. The valley was not large, perhaps 15 miles from end to end, but it was rugged and full of hiding places, narrow canyons and abandoned mine shafts, caves carved into sandstone and dense thickets of juniper, where a man could disappear for days if he knew the terrain. The Harrington brothers understood that whoever took the dynamite had either moved it out of the valley entirely, which seemed unlikely given the weight and the difficulty of navigating trails at night, or had hidden it somewhere close, intending to use it themselves or sell it piecemeal to desperate miners who couldn't afford legitimate supplies. The first lead came from a prospector named Eli Shanks, an old-timer who lived alone in a dugout on the southern edge of the valley, and who survived by trapping rabbits and panning for gold in the creek. Shanks approached Marcus Harrington 2 days after the theft, speaking in the hesitant manner of a man who knew that carrying tales could be as dangerous as keeping silent, and told him that he had seen a group of men moving through the valley late at night, 3 or 4 figures carrying heavy loads, heading west toward the ridgeline where the canyon narrowed and the cliffs closed in. Shanks couldn't identify the men in the darkness, but he remembered hearing the creak of wood and the muffled sound of something heavy being set down, and he remembered that the men moved with purpose, like they knew exactly where they were going. Marcus thanked Shanks, paid with a pouch of tobacco, and reported the information to Caleb, who immediately organized a reconnaissance team to search the western ridge. They found the cache 2 days later, hidden in a shallow cave halfway up the cliffside, accessible only by a narrow goat path that required climbing over loose scree and exposed rock. The dynamite crates were stacked against the back wall of the cave, still intact, the blasting caps and fused wire undisturbed. But what caught Caleb's attention was not the recovered dynamite, but the fact that someone had clearly been there recently, that the entrance to the cave showed fresh boot prints, that a tin cup and a canteen had been left behind, as if the thieves intended to return. Caleb made a decision. They would leave the dynamite where it was, set a watch on the cave, and wait for the thieves to come back. It was a calculated gamble, a trap baited with the very thing that had been stolen, and it required patience, discipline, and the willingness to sit in freezing cold for as long as it took. Marcus agreed without hesitation, selecting 4 men to take turns watching the cave from a concealed position across the canyon, armed with rifles and instructed to observe, not engage, until the entire group could be caught together. The wait lasted 5 days. 5 days during which the temperature dropped below 0 at night, and the wind howled through the canyon like something alive and angry. 5 days during which the men on watch rotated shifts every 6 hours, huddled behind rocks with blankets over their shoulders and rifles cradled in their laps, watching the cave entrance through field glasses and waiting for movement. On the 5th night, under a sky so clear and cold that the stars looked like shards of broken glass, the thieves returned. There were 7 of them, moving in single file along the goat path, carrying empty burlap sacks and coils of rope, clearly intending to haul the dynamite out of the cave and transport it somewhere else. The lookout, a miner named Tom Ridley, watched them approach through his field glasses, counting each man, noting the rifles slung over their shoulders and the confident way they moved, and then he sent a runner back to camp with a signal that the trap had been sprung. Caleb and Marcus mobilized immediately, gathering 12 men, arming them with rifles and revolvers, and moving through the darkness with the kind of practiced silence that comes from years of working together in close quarters. They split into 2 groups, one approaching from below to block the goat path, the other climbing to a position above the cave to cut off any escape upward. The plan was simple. Surround the thieves, call for the surrender, and if they resisted, overwhelm them with superior numbers and firepower. But plans, no matter how carefully made, have a way of collapsing when fear and pride enter the equation, and what happened next was not a controlled arrest but a sudden, chaotic eruption of violence that left 7 men dead and the canyon echoing with gunfire that could be heard for miles. The first shot came from one of the thieves, a man who panicked when he saw a movement in the darkness below and fired wildly, the crack of his rifle splitting the night air and sending echoes bouncing off the canyon walls. The Harrington men returned fire immediately, muzzle flashes lighting up the cliffside like lightning, bullets striking rock and sending sparks flying, the sound so loud and so sudden that it seemed to shake the very ground. The thieves tried to scatter, some retreating into the cave, others attempting to climb higher on the path, but they were pinned between 2 groups of armed men and had nowhere to go. Caleb Harrington shouted for them to drop their weapons and surrender, his voice barely audible over the gunfire, but his words were either unheard or ignored. The fight lasted less than 10 minutes. Though the men involved it must have felt like an eternity, a nightmarish blur of noise and motion, and the sharp smell of gunpowder hanging in the frozen air. When the shooting finally stopped, when the last echo faded and the canyon fell silent except for the sound of men breathing hard and the faint whistle of wind through the rocks, 7 bodies lay scattered along the goat path and inside the cave mouth, some killed instantly by rifle fire, others wounded and dying, their blood dark against the pale stone. The Harrington men moved carefully among the bodies, checking for survivors, collecting weapons, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. Caleb knelt beside one of the dead men, turning him over and recognized him as a drifter who had worked briefly for a rival camp before being fired for insubordination, a man whose name he couldn't quite remember, but whose face was now frozen in an expression of shock and pain. Marcus stood at the edge of the path, staring down into the darkness below, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear but from the adrenaline that still coursed through his veins, from the realization that what had been planned as a capture had turned into a massacre, and that there would be consequences, legal and otherwise, for what had just occurred. The aftermath was as bleak as the event itself. A slow unraveling of the fragile order that had existed in Red Valley, a series of investigations and accusations and recriminations that left everyone involved worse off than before. The bodies were carried down from the cliffside the next morning, wrapped in canvas and loaded onto a wagon for transport to the nearest town with coroner, which was 60 miles away over roads that were barely passable in winter. Caleb and Marcus Harrington surrendered themselves to the county sheriff 2 days later, accompanied by their lawyer, and gave statements describing the theft, the recovery operation, and the firefight that resulted. They claimed self-defense, argued that the thieves had fired first and that their men had acted to protect themselves and their property, and pointed out that the dynamite had been recovered and that justice, in a sense, had been served. The sheriff, a weary man named Hollis who had dealt with mining camp violence for most of his career, listened to the statements, reviewed the evidence, and ultimately declined to press charges, concluding that while the deaths were tragic, they were the result of actions taken by the thieves themselves when they chose to resist and to fire upon armed men in the darkness. But the legal outcome did not erase the stain of what had happened, did not bring back the 7 men who died on that frozen cliffside, did not restore the sense of security that had once existed in the valley. The rival camps looked at the Harrington outfit with a mixture of fear and resentment, understanding that the message had been sent. Cross the Harringtons and you pay with your life. Some men left the valley entirely, unwilling to work in a place where violence could erupt so suddenly and with such finality. Others stayed but kept their distance, avoiding the Harrington camp, speaking in low voices about the ambush and whether it had been justified or whether it had been an execution disguised as self-defense. Caleb and Marcus themselves were chained by the event, their confidence shaken, their sleep troubled by memories of gunfire and blood on stone. They continued to run their operation, but the energy was different. The camaraderie strained, the sense that they were building something larger than themselves replaced by the nagging awareness that they had crossed a line and could never go back. The families of the 7 dead men never received full closure, never got the answers they needed to make sense of the loss, never understood why their sons, brothers, and fathers had made the decision to steal dynamite in the first place, what desperation or greed had driven them to take such a risk, and whether they had known that it would end the way it did. Some of the families tried to pursue legal action against the Harrington brothers, hiring lawyers and filing wrongful death suits, but the cases were weak, built on emotion rather than evidence, and they were quietly dismissed by judges who understood that in places like Red Valley, the law was often secondary to the code that men live by, and that what happened on that cliffside, while tragic, was not criminal in the eyes of the court. Other families simply left, packing up what little they had, and moving east to cities where violence was not so casual, where disputes were settled in courtrooms rather than with rifles at dawn. The dynamite itself, the 40 crates that had caused so much suffering, was eventually used by the Harrington outfit to blast new tunnels and expand their operation, each explosion a reminder of what had been lost, each collapse of rock and rubble a small echo of the larger collapse that had occurred in the valley's social fabric. By the end of 1927, the Harrington operation had grown significantly, employing more men, extracting more ore, and making more money than ever before. But Caleb and Marcus took no joy in the success, understanding that it had been built on a foundation of blood and fear, and that no amount of profit could erase the memory of 7 bodies carried down a mountainside in the cold light of morning. Red Valley today is not the same place it was in 1926. The mining camps long abandoned, the tunnels collapsed, the wooden shacks rotted away or blown down by wind and weather. The cliffs remain red and weathered, standing as silent witnesses to the violence that unfolded here nearly a century ago, and the canyon where 7 men died is still there, overgrown now with sagebrush and juniper, the goat path barely visible, the cave mouth hidden by rockfall and time. Hikers occasionally pass through the area, unaware of the history beneath their feet, unaware that they are walking over ground stained by decisions made in desperation and executed with brutal finality. The Harrington brothers are long dead, their names recorded in county records and old newspaper clippings, their legacy reduced to a footnote in the history of Wyoming mining, a cautionary tale about what happens when men decide that property is worth more than life, that reputation is worth more than mercy. The 7 men who died on that cliffside are remembered, if at all, as thieves, as men who made a fatal mistake, but their families knew them as more than that, as fathers who worked hard, as brothers who sent money home, as sons who wrote letters promising to return when they had saved enough to start over somewhere else. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the complexity between those two narratives, in the gray space where survival and morality intersect, where desperation drives good men to do bad things, and where the consequences ripple outward long after the gunfire has faded. The story of the Red Valley ambush raises questions that have no easy answers, Questions about justice and vengeance, about the value of property versus the value of life, about what we owe to those who wrong us and what we owe to ourselves when we respond to that wrong. Caleb and Marcus Harrington believed they were defending what was theirs, protecting their livelihood and the livelihoods of the men who depended on them, enforcing a code that had governed mining camps since the first prospectors arrived in the West. They believed that letting the theft go unpunished would invite further predation, that weakness would be exploited, that the only way to survive in a place like Red Valley was to be feared, to be known as men who would not hesitate to use violence when violence was called for. But belief does not erase consequence, and the consequence of that night on the cliffside was 7 dead men, 7 families shattered, and a valley forever marked by the knowledge that when push came to shove, when dynamite was stolen and pride was wounded, the response was not restraint but annihilation. The thieves, for their part, made a choice as well, a choice to take what did not belong to them, to risk their lives for 40% gelatin dynamite and potential profit represented, and that choice, however misguided, was still theirs to make and theirs to suffer for. The tragedy is not that one side was right and the other wrong, but that both sides believed so completely in their righteousness that they could not see any path forward except through violence, could not imagine a resolution that did not involve death, could not step back from the edge even when the edge was clearly visible. In the end, the Red Valley ambush was not about dynamite at all, though dynamite was a catalyst, the spark that ignited the fuse. It was about men living on the margins of civilization, where the structures that normally constrain violence were absent or weak, where disputes were settled not by courts and contracts but by force and reputation, where survival depended on being harder, tougher, more willing to use violence than the next man. It was about a code of honor that demanded retaliation, that equated forgiveness with weakness, that saw theft not as a crime to be punished by law, but as a personal insult to be avenged personally. It was about the isolation of mining camps, the long winters, the grinding poverty, the constant awareness that death was always close, whether from cave-ins, explosions, disease, or the violence of other desperate men. And it was about the human capacity for self-justification, the ability to convince ourselves that what we are about to do is necessary, is the only option available, even when somewhere deep inside we know that there's always another option, always a choice, always a moment when we can step back and choose a different path. The canyon where it happened still stands, indifferent to the human drama that played out on its cliffs, indifferent to blood that soaked into its soil, indifferent to the passage of time and the fading of memory. The wind still howls through the rocks at night, carrying no ghosts, no voices, no echoes of the gunfire that once shattered the silence. The red cliffs still glow at sunset, beautiful and impassive, a reminder that nature does not judge, does not remember, does not care about the small tragedies of men who thought their conflicts mattered, who thought their codes and their honor and their dynamite were worth dying for. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Red Valley, not that violence is wrong or right, not that the Harringtons were heroes or villains, not that the thieves deserved their fate or did not deserve it, but that in the grand scheme of things, in the long arc of history, what we think matters so much, what we are willing to kill for and die for, is often revealed to be tragically small, a momentary flare of human passion that burns bright and hot and then fades, leaving nothing behind but questions and sorrow and the slow erosion of memory. The names have changed, the valley has changed, the world has moved on, but the question remains, echoing through the years like the crack of a rifle in a frozen canyon. What are we willing to become when someone takes what we believe is ours? Are we willing to become killers? Are we willing to cross the line between defending what we have and destroying those who threaten it? Are we willing to live with the consequences, with the blood on our hands, with the knowledge that in choosing violence we have surrendered something essential, something that cannot be recovered no matter how much dynamite we retrieve, no matter how much we extract, no matter how much money we make or how much fear we inspire? The Harrington brothers made their choice, and 7 men died for it, and in the end neither side won. Because in conflicts like these there are no winners, only survivors who carry the weight of what they have done, only families who mourn, only valleys that bear witness and then forget. This is the story of Red Valley, a story of theft and retribution, of cold nights and colder choices, of men who believe in codes and men who broke them, and of the moment when those two beliefs collided with such force that 7 lives were snuffed out like candles in the wind, leaving behind only darkness and the faint smell of gunpowder and the endless, unanswerable question of whether any of it was worth it, whether any theft, any insult, any violation of property or pride is worth the price of a human life, and whether the line between justice and murder is as clear as we like to believe, or whether it is as thin and fragile as the ice that covered the creek in Red Valley that winter, waiting for the weight of our certainty to shatter it and plunge us into the cold, unforgiving water below. But the story of Red Valley does not end with 7 bodies on a cliffside, does not conclude with a sheriff's report filed away in a dusty archive, does not fade into the comfortable distance of historical curiosity. Stories like this one have roots that reach deeper than we care to admit, branches that extend into the present, and seeds that continue to germinate in the soil of human nature, waiting for the right conditions to sprout again. The Red Valley ambush was not an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of a larger disease, a manifestation of the violence that simmered beneath the surface of the American West in the 1920s, a period we often romanticize as a final chapter of frontier independence, but which was in reality a brutal transition between lawlessness and civilization, between codes enforced by guns and codes enforced by courts, between men who settled disputes with their hands and men who settled them with lawyers. And in that transition, there were casualties, hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, men who died not in grand battles or heroic last stands, but in petty conflicts over stolen property, wounded pride, and the desperate economics of survival. The Harrington brothers, in the months and years following the ambush, became prisoners of their own reputation. They had wanted to send a message, to establish themselves as men not to be trifled with, and they succeeded beyond their expectations. But the cost of that success was a kind of social isolation that neither of them had anticipated. Other miners in the valley gave them a wide berth, speaking to them only when necessary, avoiding eye contact, treating them with a deference that was rooted not in respect but in fear. New workers were harder to recruit, because word had spread to the network of camps and rail towns that the Harringtons were trigger-happy, that they had killed 7 men over a few crates of dynamite, and that working for them meant living under the constant threat of violence. Caleb, who had always prided himself on running a fair operation, found himself questioning every decision, second-guessing every order, wondering if his men obeyed him because they trusted him or because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't. Marcus, more volatile by nature, handled the aftermath differently, throwing himself into work with manic intensity, spending 16-hour days in the tunnels, driving his crew harder than ever, as if physical exhaustion could silence the voices in his head that whispered accusations in the darkness. He drank more, slept less, and developed a habit of checking and rechecking his revolver before bed, pulling it from a holster, spinning the cylinder, testing the action, as if the weapon itself could protect him not from external threats, but from the internal ones that gnawed at his conscience. The families of the dead men did not disappear quietly into the footnotes of history. They grieved, they raged, they demanded answers, and when those answers proved unsatisfying, they turned to whatever means of redress were available to them. Sarah Mitchum, widow of one of the thieves, a woman of 34 with 3 children to feed and no income, wrote letters to the governor of Wyoming, to the county prosecutor, to anyone she thought might listen, describing her husband not as a thief, but as a desperate man who had taken a risk because his family was starving, because the mine he worked for had closed without warning, because the winter had been harsh and there were no other options. Her letters were heartbreaking in their simplicity, handwritten on cheap paper, the words sometimes smudged where tears had fallen, each one a plea not for revenge but for recognition, for acknowledgement that her husband had been a human being, that his life had mattered, that his death had not been justified simply because he had made a mistake. The letters went unanswered for the most part, filed away by bureaucrats who had seen 100 similar tragedies and had long since stopped believing that the system could provide justice for people like Sarah Mitchum. But one letter reached a journalist in Cheyenne, a man named Arthur Grimes, who specialized in stories about labor disputes and mining camp violence. And Grimes saw in the Red Valley ambush a narrative that could capture public attention and perhaps even spark a conversation about the need for better regulation of the mining industry, for worker protections, for some kind of legal framework that could prevent disputes from escalating into massacres. Grimes traveled to Red Valley in the spring of 1927, arriving on a freight train and making his way on foot to the site of the ambush, interviewing anyone who would talk to him, taking photographs of the canyon, the cave, the goat path where the shootout had occurred. He spoke with Caleb and Marcus Harrington, who were initially reluctant to engage but eventually agreed to sit for an interview, perhaps hoping that their side of the story would be told fairly, that the public would understand that they had been defending their property, that the thieves had fired first, that what happened was tragic but unavoidable. Grimes listened carefully, took detailed notes, and then wrote an article that was published in the Cheyenne Tribune under the headline, 7 Men Dead for 40 Crates. The Red Valley Ambush and the Cost of Frontier Justice. The article was not kind to the Harrington brothers. It portrayed them as ruthless enforcers of an outdated code, men who had chosen violence over negotiation, who had set a trap with the intention of killing rather than apprehending, who had demonstrated a callous disregard for human life in their pursuit of stolen property. Grimes interviewed Sarah Mitchum and quoted extensively from her letters, humanizing the dead men in ways that the Harringtons had not anticipated, describing their families, their struggles, their dreams of earning enough money to leave the valley and start over somewhere else. The article sparked outrage in some quarters and indifference in others, with urban readers expressing shock at the brutality of mining camp life, while rural readers shrugged and pointed out that theft was theft and that men who stole dynamite knew the risks they were taking. But the article also accomplished something else. It made the Red Valley Ambush a public event, a story that could not be buried or forgotten, a piece of history that would be debated, analyzed, and remembered long after the participants were dead. The legal aftermath dragged on for years, not in the form of criminal trials, which had been concluded quickly, but in civil suits, appeals, and bureaucratic wrangling over compensation for the families. Some of the families received small settlements from the mining company that had employed their husbands, payouts designed more to avoid bad publicity than provide meaningful support, sums that barely covered funeral expenses and did nothing to replace lost income or ease the burden of raising children alone. Other families received nothing, their claims denied on the grounds that their loved ones had been engaged in criminal activity at the time of their deaths and were therefore not entitled to compensation. The inequity of it all, the sense that justice was distributed according to wealth and influence rather than merit or need, fueled a growing resentment among working-class miners throughout the region, a resentment that would eventually contribute to the labor movements of the 1930s, the strikes and unionization efforts that sought to give workers some measure of power in their dealings with mine owners and operators. The Red Valley Ambush became a rallying cry for union organizers, a cautionary tale about what happened when workers had no legal recourse, no protections, no way to resolve disputes except through violence or submission. Posters appeared in mining towns showing the 7 dead men and asking, "How many more must die before we demand justice?" And while the Harrington brothers were never mentioned by name in these materials, everyone knew the posters were referring to. Everyone understood that the ambush had become a symbol of something larger than itself, a symbol of the power imbalance between owners and workers, between those who had the law on their side and those who did not. Caleb Harrington died in 1934, at the age of 50, not from violence but from a heart attack that struck him while he was inspecting a new tunnel shaft. He collapsed without warning, falling into the arms of his foreman. His last word a mumbled instruction about checking support beams for cracks. His funeral was attended by a few dozen people, mostly men who had worked for him over the years, and the eulogy delivered by a local pastor was brief and awkward, touching on Caleb's work ethic and his contributions to the regional economy, while carefully avoiding any mention of the ambush or the controversy that had defined the latter part of his life. Marcus attended the funeral but did not speak, standing at the graveside with his hat in his hands, his face expressionless, and when the service ended he walked away alone, refusing offers of condolence from men who had once called him friend. He continued to run the operation for another 3 years, but his heart was no longer in it, and in 1937 he sold the mining rights to a larger company, took the money, and left Wyoming entirely, moving to California, where he lived out the remainder of his life in obscurity, working odd jobs and drinking heavily, never speaking about Red Valley or the ambush or the night that 7 men died on a frozen cliffside. He died in 1942, alone in a boarding house in Sacramento, his body not discovered for 3 days. And when his landlord finally notified the authorities and they searched his room, they found among his possessions a single photograph, creased and faded, showing a group of men standing in front of a mining camp, young and strong and unaware of what was coming, their faces frozen in time, their futures still unwritten. The cave where the dynamite was hidden is still there, or at least it was until the 1970s when a rock slide partially collapsed the entrance, sealing it off from casual exploration. Local historians made efforts to preserve the site, recognizing its significance, but funding was scarce and interest limited, and eventually the cave was left to nature, to the slow processes of erosion and decay that erase all human endeavors given enough time. The goat path is gone, overgrown with vegetation. The loose scree that made it treacherous now stabilized by roots and soil. The cliffs remain, of course, red and ancient, standing as they have stood for millions of years, indifferent to the brief flicker of human drama that played out in their shadow. Tourists occasionally visit Red Valley, drawn by stories of the Old West or by the natural beauty of the landscape, and some of them learn about the ambush from interpretive signs placed by the Historical Society, brief summaries that reduce a complex tragedy to a few hundred words and a map showing the approximate location of the shootout. Most visitors take a few photographs, maybe pause to imagine what it must have been like, and then move on, the story already fading from their minds by the time they reach the next scenic overlook. But for those who look deeper, who dig into archives and read old newspapers and track down descendants of people involved, the Red Valley ambush reveals itself as something more than a historical footnote, more than a violent episode in a violent time. It becomes a lens through which to examine the values and assumptions that govern life on the American frontier, the belief that property was sacred, that reputation was everything, that violence was an acceptable tool for resolving disputes, and that human life, while valuable in the abstract, could be expendable when it came into conflict with economic interests or personal pride. These were not the values of monsters or outliers, but of ordinary men, men who had been shaped by their environment, by the stories they had been told about what it meant to be strong, to be respected, to be a man worth following. Caleb and Marcus Harrington were not born killers. They were born into a world that taught them that killing, under the right circumstances, was not only acceptable but necessary, and they internalized that lesson so thoroughly that when the moment came, when the choice presented itself, they did not hesitate, did not question, did not consider alternatives. And the 7 men who died were not born thieves. They were born into poverty and desperation, into a world where survival often required bending or breaking rules, where the line between right and wrong was constantly shifting, and where the consequences of a single bad decision could be swift and final. The children of the dead men grew up without fathers, carrying the weight of that absence in ways that shaped their entire lives. Some became bitter, nursing grudges against the Harringtons and against the system that had failed to hold them accountable, passing that bitterness down to their own children in the form of stories told around kitchen tables, stories that grew darker and more accusatory with each retelling. Others tried to move on, to build new lives untainted by the past, to forget or at least not dwell on the violence that had shattered their families. But forgetting proved harder than they expected, because the past is a way of asserting itself, of showing up uninvited in dreams and memories and in the faces of strangers who remind you of someone lost. One of those children, a boy named Daniel whose father had been killed in the ambush, grew up to become a lawyer, driven by a desire to ensure that what happened to his family would never happen to anyone else, that disputes could be resolved through legal means rather than through violence. He practiced law in Wyoming for 40 years, representing miners and workers in labor disputes, winning settlements and protections his father could never have imagined. And in his office, he kept a photograph of the 7 men, not as a shrine, but as a reminder of what happens when the law fails to protect the vulnerable, when justice is left to be administered by whoever has the most guns and the least hesitation about using them. The legacy of the Red Valley ambush is not one of heroes or villains, but of choices and consequences, of the human capacity for rationalization and self-deception, of the thin veneer of civilization that separates order from chaos. It is a story that asks us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about the violence that lurks beneath our moral codes, about the ease with which we can convince ourselves that what we are doing is right, is necessary, is the only option available. It is a story that reminds us that the past is not a foreign country but a mirror, reflecting back at us the same conflicts, the same temptations, the same failures that we face today, in different forms perhaps, but with the same essential character. And it is a story that refuses to offer easy answers, that declines to tell us who is right and who is wrong, that leaves us instead with questions that we must answer for ourselves. What would we have done in the same situation? Would we have stolen the dynamite if our families were starving? Would we have set the trap if our livelihoods were threatened? Would we have pulled the trigger when the shooting started? And having pulled it, could we have lived with ourselves afterward? Could we have slept at night? Could we have looked at our own reflections without seeing the faces of the dead staring back at us? The wind still blows through Red Valley, cold and indifferent, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the memory of gunfire. And if you listen carefully on certain nights, when the air is still and the stars are bright, you might hear the echo of voices calling out in the darkness, might hear the crack of rifles and the sound of men breathing their last, might hear the questions that have no answers and the silence that follows them. But more likely you will hear nothing, because the valley has moved on, because time has done what time always does, erasing the evidence, smoothing the rough edges, turning tragedy into history and history into myth and myth into nothing at all. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the only mercy the dead can receive is to be forgotten, to be released from the burden of being remembered as symbols or lessons or cautionary tales, to simply fade into the earth that claimed them and be at peace. Until the next time, there is a moment in every story of violence when we must ask ourselves not what happened, but why it continues to happen, why the same patterns repeat across decades and centuries, why men in different times and different places make the same choices and suffer the same consequences. The Red Valley ambush was not unique. It was not an aberration. It was not the result of exceptional cruelty or unusual circumstance. It was, instead, the inevitable outcome of a system that valued property over people, that glorified violence as strength, that taught men that the only way to protect what was theirs was to be willing to destroy anyone who threatened it. And that system did not die with Caleb and Marcus Harrington. It did not disappear when the mining camps closed and the frontier moved on. It persists, transformed perhaps, wearing different clothes and speaking different languages, but fundamentally unchanged in its essential character, in its willingness to sacrifice human life on the altar of ownership, reputation, and pride. The 7 men who died on that cliffside in 1926 were not the first to pay this price, and they were not the last. Their names that most of us will never know, names that are forgotten even before their bodies were cold, join a long list of casualties, a roll call of the dead that stretches back to the first moment one human being decided that something mattered more than another human being's life. And that list continues to grow, every day, in every corner of the world, wherever desperation meets pride, wherever theft becomes betrayal, wherever the line between justice and vengeance blurs until it disappears entirely. We tell ourselves that we are different, that we would choose differently, that we would find another way, a better way, a way that does not end in blood and regret. But the truth is that most of us have never been tested, have never stood at the edge of that canyon with a rifle in our hands and a choice to make, have never had to decide whether the thing we are protecting is worth the life we are about to take. And until we are tested, we cannot know with certainty what we would do, what we would become, what compromises we would make with our own humanity in order to survive, to win, to avoid being the one who loses. The canyon remembers nothing. The cliffs stand indifferent. The wind carries no judgment. Nature does not distinguish between the blood of thieves and the blood of enforcers, does not preserve the memory of who was right and who was wrong, does not care that 7 men died for 40 crates of dynamite, or that 2 brothers spent the rest of their lives haunted by what they had done. In 100 years and 1,000, when all of us are dust and the stories we tell about ourselves have faded into silence, Red Valley will still be there, red and ancient and unchanged, a testament to the only truth that matters in the end, that we are small, that our conflicts are smaller still, and that the things we kill for, the things we die for, the things we convince ourselves are worth any price, are revealed in the long perspective of time to be tragically, heartbreakingly, insignificant. But we cannot live in that long perspective. We live in the moment, in the immediacy of need and fear and desire, and in those moments the 40 crates of dynamite matter, the stolen property matters, the wounded pride matters, and the choice to pull the trigger feels not like a moral failure, but like the only rational response to an impossible situation. This is a trap we set for ourselves, the cage we build with our own values and our own stories about what it means to be strong, to be respected, to be someone who cannot be crossed without consequence. And once we are inside that cage, once we have accepted its logic and internalized its rules, the path to violence becomes not a deviation but a straight line, not a breaking of who we are but fulfillment of it. And the 7 bodies on the cliffside become not a tragedy but a necessity, Not something to be mourned, but something to be justified, explained, defended, until the justification becomes so rehearsed that we almost believe it ourselves. The question that the Red Valley ambush leaves us with is not whether the Harrington brothers were right or wrong, not whether the thieves deserved their fate, not whether the law should have intervened or stayed away. The question is simpler and more difficult than that. What are we willing to become? When the test comes, when our security is threatened and our pride is wounded and our property is taken, what will we choose? Will we choose the path that preserves our humanity, even if it costs us something we cannot afford to lose? Or will we choose the path that preserves our power, our reputation, our things, even if it costs us something far more valuable? The ability to look at ourselves without flinching, to sleep without nightmares, to live without the weight of the dead pressing down on our chests every time we close our eyes? The Harrington brothers made their choice, and they lived with it, or tried to, and in the end it consumed them as surely as the dynamite they fought to protect consumed the rock, an earth it was designed to destroy. The 7 thieves made their choice as well, and they died for it, their lives traded for a few crates of explosive, their families left to grieve and struggle, and wonder if there had been another way, a better way, a way that would have allowed their fathers and brothers and sons to come home. These are the choices that define us, not in the abstract, but in the concrete reality of blood and consequence, and the Red Valley ambush stands as a reminder that those choices are never as clear as we imagine them to be, that the line between justice and murder is drawn not in stone, but in sand, easily erased by the wind of circumstance and the tide of emotion, and that once we cross it, once we step over that line and commit ourselves to violence as the solution, the way back is not a path, but a chasm, impossible to bridge, impossible to uncross, leaving us stranded on the far side with nothing but our justifications to keep us company and the knowledge that we have become something we never intended to be. The story ends here in Red Valley, where the past refuses to stay buried, where the wind still carries echoes of gunfire and the cliffs still stand witness to what we are capable of when we believe we have no other choice. It ends with 7 names forgotten and 2 names remembered for all the wrong reasons, with families broken and fortunes made, and a legacy that teaches us nothing we want to learn. It ends the way it began, with a question that has no answer, with a choice that has no good outcome, with a line that is easy to cross and impossible to return from. And it will begin again, somewhere else, in some other valley, with some other men and some other stolen property, and some other moment when desperation meets pride and violence seems like the only solution, because that is what we do, that is who we are, that is the story we've been telling ourselves since the beginning of human history. And until we learn to tell a different story, until we find a different way to resolve our conflicts and protect our interests and defend our pride, the Red Valley ambush will repeat itself endlessly, a cycle of blood and regret that we cannot break because we cannot see or will not see that the cage we live in was built by our own hands and can be dismantled by them as well.